October 1944. Over the past 2 years, Allied forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz have fought a hard-won series of victories across the Pacific theater. Battles at Midway, Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea, and the New Guinea Campaign, and many others have led to this moment, and to the possibility of redemption. In the spring of 1942, the Philippines, a major strategic point in the Pacific and home to 17 million people, had been successfully invaded by the Japanese in what is widely considered one of the worst military defeats in American history. On the Bataan Peninsula, an estimated 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers were taken prisoner and subjected to the horrors of the Bataan Death March, forced labor camps, and hell ships. Across the islands, around 8,000 Allied civilians were forced into internment camps, where they endured disease and starvation. And outside the prison camps, the Filipino population suffers atrocities at the hands of their occupiers. Ordered out of the Philippines by President Roosevelt in March 1942, MacArthur promised to return to the country he had been charged with defending. Between spring 1942 and fall 1944, MacArthur and Nimitz worked together to liberate the islands of the Pacific. Under their direction, the New Guinea and the Solomon, Gilbert, Bismarck, Marshall, Admiralty, and Marianas Islands were retaken from Japanese control. These successful campaigns were characterized by island hopping, bypassing enemy strongpoints, and by using Army and naval air power, along with active guerrilla resistance movements across Japanese-occupied territories. Discussions and military action following the Pearl Harbor Conference in July 1944 determined that the next Allied targets will be the Philippines. Air assaults on the islands of Luzon and Leyte begin in that September and continue through October. On October 20th, Allied forces make a successful landing at Leyte. MacArthur broadcasts the return across the islands, keeping the promise he had made in 1942.
This is the voice of freedom, General MacArthur speaking. People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil consecrated in the blood of our two peoples. We have come dedicated and committed to the task of destroying every vestige of enemy control over your daily lives and of restoring, upon a foundation of indestructible strength, the liberties of your people.
The Japanese are not about to let the Philippines go without a fight. The Imperial Japanese Army arrives off Leyte to destroy MacArthur's invasion force. Over the next several days, the largest naval battle in history will be fought in the waters of the Philippines. Its outcome will determine not just the fate of the Philippines, but the very end of the war itself.
Good morning and welcome to the MacArthur Memorial. My name is Amanda Williams and I have the honor of serving as the director of the MacArthur Memorial. And about 80 years ago, the largest naval battle in history was fought off the coast of the Philippines. And today we mark that anniversary, not only of the battle, but also of the role that it played in the liberation of the Philippines. Are there any veterans of the Pacific War here with us today? Any veterans of World War II? Any theater? Any civilian survivors of the war in the Philippines? Any family members of any of those groups? Okay, well, thank you all for being here with us today. Keeping these stories alive is an effort that I think requires all hands, and so we're very grateful for you all here today to help us commemorate this anniversary. So today's event is a partnership between the MacArthur Memorial and the Hampton Roads Naval Museum, and it is sponsored by the Navy League of Hampton Roads and the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation. At this time, I would like you to join me in welcoming Dr. Rodrigo Romulo. He serves on the board of directors of the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation, and he is a physician whose career has spanned over 3 decades, mainly in the clinical practice of infectious and tropical diseases, but also in medical education, public health, advocacy, and international public health. He is also the grandson of Carlos Romulo, the Filipino statesman, soldier, and journalist who waded ashore at Leyte with General MacArthur. Sir?
Thank you, Amanda, and good morning to everyone. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation, I am delighted to welcome you all to this commemoration of this most significant event that occurred 80 years ago. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, this largest of naval battles in history, broke the back of the Japanese Imperial Navy, led to the liberation of the Philippines, the fall of Japan, and ultimately our current world order, shaky as that is. And we are fortunate today to have two distinguished speakers who will enlighten us about the events on the water and on land that comprise this historic battle. But this event has personal significance for me. First, because I spent time doing field research in schistosomiasis. This is a parasitic disease that infects individuals wading through infested waters. That's endemic in Leyte, so I spent some time there studying this disease that affects the farmers, but it also caused an outbreak among the US troops that landed there. But more than that, I was raised by a generation of Filipinos who endured the horrors of the Japanese military occupation in the Philippines. This Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the beginning of the end of that nightmare for them. My grandfather, as you heard, served on General Douglas MacArthur's staff and proudly waded ashore on Leyte Beach with him that fateful day 80 years ago. He was not only hopeful that he would find his wife and 4 sons, from whom he was separated for almost 3 years, and he did several months later. But he was also hopeful that, having suffered the tunnels of Corregidor and the foxholes of Bataan, escaping in the last hours before the surrender 2.5 years earlier, he was hopeful that he would see the Philippines rise again. And he did. He later shared, and I quote, "It is impossible to adequately record the joy of the Philippine people at MacArthur's return. The people who met us at the beach with tears in their eyes, some of them starving skeletons in rags, saw the Americans as a godsend. In that moment of landing, I remembered our Bataan dead, who had been left unmarked, unburied, and unavenged. I remember them as I saw the American flag flying from a coconut tree, and beside it, our own Filipino flag. That was my first thought and my first prayer on Leyte Beach, that our long-neglected dead might rest more easily that night on Bataan." And I end on this note, as we today listen to the grand scheme of how the strategies and countermeasures and conflicts in the battle emerged, so that with renewed gratitude for their sacrifice, we too will remember those that lost their lives in this fight for freedom that is now ours. And we'll continue to thank those who are continuing this fight for their heroic service. Thank you all again for being here with us today.
Please join me now in welcoming John Pentangelo, Director of the Hampton Roads Naval Museum.
Thank you, Amanda. Good morning, everyone. Just a quick introduction. The Hampton Roads Naval Museum is one of 10 official Department of the Navy museums. We're administered by the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, D.C. And we exist next to the battleship Wisconsin inside Nauticus, and our museum is very proud to make history a core component of a sailor's education, but also to help the American people better understand and appreciate their Navy. I do hope that if you have not been there, you can come visit us soon. 5 years ago, when the Navy celebrated its 244th birthday, the Director of Naval History advised the Chief of Naval Operations to select the theme of No Higher Honor. This was in recognition of the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And the phrase "no higher honor" comes from the commander of the destroyer escort, USS Samuel B. Roberts, and he was referring to his pride in the ship's crew during the Battle off Samar, one of 4 engagements that comprised the naval battle. Often called the largest battle in naval history, it included over 280 ships fighting 4 battles over 100,000 miles of ocean, and is also famous as the last engagement between battleships. And besides the operational lessons the battle offers to naval personnel and naval history enthusiasts, Leyte Gulf offers the men and women serving today an even more critical and necessary lesson, and one of sacrifice and courage and the pride in service which is necessary to sustain an armed force. Specifically, the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea demonstrated how air power had come to redefine naval warfare. The Japanese battleship Musashi, the largest battleship ever built, took over 20 hits from aerial bombs and torpedoes, sinking in the ocean with over 1,000 sailors, another signal that the era of the battleship was in its final death throes. The Battle of Surigao Strait offers a classic example of large-scale surface engagement between battleships, reminiscent of the kind that they fought in World War I at the Battle of the Jutland. Elements of the 7th Fleet, under the command of Jesse Oldendorf, famously crossed the T of the Japanese Southern Force, almost guaranteeing its complete annihilation. Admiral Halsey's decision to attack the Japanese Northern Force resulted in a victory at the Battle off Cape Engano, but also caused great controversy, leaving the 7th Fleet vulnerable on its northern flank. Finally, and most famously, the Japanese Center Force failed to cripple the 7th Fleet due to the uncommon bravery of the commanders and crew of Task Force 77, also known as Taffy 3. The outmatched and outgunned force of escort carriers, destroyers, and escort vessels, most notably the doomed destroyer USS Johnston, fought with such tenacity and heroism that we now sit in a room 80 years later to remember it. And we do not study history for its own sake, but to help the Navy and the citizenry it defends to learn critical lessons to meet the challenges of tomorrow. And the victory at Leyte demonstrated the importance of planning, the importance of having a unified command structure and working communications, the need for informed dissent, and that one commander or crew's act of sacrifice can make the difference between disaster and ultimate victory. Before I introduce our speaker to tell us more about the naval side of the battle, I want to thank the staff of the Hampton Roads Naval Museum, especially our special events coordinator, Mark Freeman. A very gracious thank you to Amanda and the entire staff of the MacArthur Memorial for being such steadfast partners and for hosting this lecture. And lastly, thank you to our nonprofit partner, the Navy League of Hampton Roads, for funding the event and for helping to build a brighter future for the museum and the entire U.S. Navy. Our speaker today is retired Lieutenant Commander Tom Culter. Culter enlisted in the United States Navy in 1965, but was commissioned an ensign in 1969, rising to lieutenant commander a decade later and remaining on active duty until 1990. A combat veteran of Vietnam, he has continued to dedicate his life to the U.S. Navy as a historian, an educator, and a prolific author. Not only has he written histories of the Vietnam War and Leyte Gulf and other important conflicts, he's written a sailor's history of the United States Navy, a parent's guide to the United States Navy, and a citizen's guide to the United States Navy, along with multiple editions of the famous Blue Jackets Manual. And here to discuss the naval side of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, please welcome Tom Culter.
Well, after that introduction and the opening remarks, I'm not sure there's much left to say. That was a very good summary of the coming battle, but hopefully I can shed a little bit more light. I was within several days of going to my in-country tour in Vietnam, and for some reason I'd gone to some kind of a formal event and wore my dress whites. And in the Navy, the dress whites include a ceremonial sword. And after the event, we went back to the house and had some friends over, and people were interested in that sword. You know, swords are kind of unique, and they wanted to see this thing or whatever. So that evening, I was putting my 4-year-old son to bed, and I could tell something was bothering him. And I said, what's going on, Chris? And he said, I'm depressed. 4-year-old son. And I said, well, what are you depressed about? And he said, well, you're going off to Vietnam to fight the bad guys, and you're awful slow taking that sword out. True story. Well, we're not here to talk about Vietnam, certainly not here to talk about me, but we are here to talk about sailors going to war. And this was, as has already been mentioned several times, the largest naval battle in history. You can see from the slide up here why I say that, spanning, already pointed out, more than 100,000 square miles. Lots of people died on both sides in this battle. One of the interesting parts of it is that it covered every facet of naval warfare that existed at the time, and that's one of the things that makes it interesting. Keep in mind, we call it a battle. It's really a series of battles that all take place within a couple of days. But it is, in fact, a huge endeavor. As already mentioned, it's the last clash of battleships. It's the only time a U.S. aircraft carrier was sunk by gunfire. And as you see by the alternating blues and reds in that thing below, there's a lot about the battle, both good and bad, that we can learn from and be inspired by. The origins of that, as we stand here in this hallowed hall, begin with General Douglas MacArthur's having to leave the Philippines early in the war and being forced to leave by FDR. As you can imagine, there was a certain reluctance to carry out that order. But when he arrived in Australia, he promised the Filipino people and the world that he would return. And of course, that's why we're here to talk about that return today. The reason that a little background we should know is that Nimitz and MacArthur both commanded separate theaters during World War II. Nimitz handling the Central Pacific with the famous places at Tarawa and Midway and various other battles that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And then MacArthur, in the meantime, was running the Southwest Pacific Command. And they operated virtually independently throughout the most of the war. However, at one point, these two advancing prongs came together, and it was a question of where to go next. They had conquered the things that they were required to, and now there was a question of where to go. Well, the Navy, and Nimitz in particular, wanted to go to Formosa, today's Taiwan. They felt that that was the best strategic move at this point in the war. But the Army under MacArthur, as you can imagine, wanted to go to the Philippines for a number of reasons. And it actually came down to the commander-in-chief mediating between these two. FDR actually boarded a cruiser, the cruiser Baltimore, and traveled out to Pearl Harbor. And he met there with MacArthur and Nimitz, and they in turn were given the opportunity to express their views of where we should go next. FDR made the ultimate decision based on MacArthur's persuasiveness to go back to the Philippines. One of the arguments that he made, one of the most valid arguments, was that he said that the Filipino people understand why we were driven out by Japan early in the war. They understand that it takes time to come back, but they will never understand if we bypass them at this point in the war. And I think that was a very telling argument among many others. As a result, MacArthur won and was able to conduct Operation King II, which was the return to the Philippines, the amphibious landing on Leyte Island. To do this, as I mentioned, we've got MacArthur had Navy forces under him, under Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid with the 7th Fleet, and Nimitz had the 3rd Fleet, sometimes called the 5th Fleet, but that's another story, but the 3rd Fleet under Admiral Halsey. So they're coming together to conduct a joint operation for the first time in the Philippines. So you have these two important fleets coming together. The missions, as you can see, the 7th Fleet took on the mission of the actual amphibious assault and the support forces to do that. The 3rd Fleet was there to, quote, support and defend. Not in a whole lot of detail there, but that was what it was there for, tasked with. As you can imagine, or you should be aware that the 3rd Fleet was a ginormous fleet, probably the largest fleet in history, with tremendous capability, and Halsey and 3rd Fleet are lurking around the Philippines in case the Japanese show up. So here you have the General Douglas MacArthur in charge of one side of the operation and Nimitz on the other. What's interesting about this is that if you want an overall commander between these two gentlemen, you have to go all the way to Washington, D.C. There is no on-scene commander in charge of the whole operation. And they're operating, even though they're in the same vicinity, they're operating largely independently, not even talking to each other in many cases. The Japanese come up with a response that they call Operation Show 1, Victory 1 was the translation. They had 4 converging forces coming to, for virtually a last stand attempt to try to stop this. Here you see the Philippines, and you have Admiral Kurita coming up from down south where the oil was, bringing a rather large force of battleships and cruisers, and coming up, and he's going to cross the Sibuyan Sea and come out through San Bernardino Strait, and will ultimately attack the forces at Leyte from the north. Admiral Nishimura, also coming up from the south, has a group that is going to go across the Sulu Sea and come up through Surigao Strait and attack from the south. There's also another force under Admiral Shima coming down from the north who has the same mission as Nishimura, but the two are not coming together. They actually are supposed to arrive at the same time. And last but not least is Admiral Ozawa, and he has a rather interesting role in all of this. He has what's left of the Japanese carrier forces, and those forces at this point in the war are decimated. The ships are there, but the aircraft and pilots are not. There are about 100 aircraft that's left for these aircraft carriers. We, the United States, do not know that. We know they've been hurt, but we don't know to what degree. So because of that, at this point in the war, the carriers have played the major force in the war. And so the idea for Ozawa is to come down from the north and hopefully lure the Americans under Admiral Halsey to go after them. So what you have here is 2 vital elements, a pincher movement coming down from the north and from the south, and you also have a decoy hoping to lure off major parts of the American fleet there. The problem with this, of course, is that a pincher needs perfect timing. It's kind of like having a pair of pliers with only one side, doesn't do much good. And the other one is a decoy, of course, needs a lot of luck. You have to depend, you're scripting the enemy to do what you're bidding. You're hoping that the enemy will take the bait as it was. So a quick overview of the battle. The way it takes place is the American forces land at Leyte, and the amphibious landing goes pretty much as planned, no major problems there. You've got the American 3rd Fleet lurking out there, as I said, standing by. The first thing that comes up is the force under Admiral Kurita is coming along the Palawan Passage. And en route there, he encounters 2 American submarines. And that is the first engagement of the forces during this battle. The next part takes place in the Sibuyan Sea as already mentioned, there are air attacks there. The Halsey's forces are dropping many bombs on these forces and causing a great deal of damage and slowing Kurita's progress down. Down here you have the Battle of Surigao Strait. We'll talk about that when these forces come up from the south. And then up to the way to the north is the Battle of Cape Engano, where Halsey does engage Ozawa's forces up there. And of course, then we also have, the Battle off Samar, which is probably the most famous part of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. As I mentioned, the first blood occurs when Kurita is coming up from the south, going along Palawan Passage there, and these two American submarines, the Darter and the Dace, are there waiting, and they see, this is an actual photograph taken from one of the submarines. That's Kurita's force coming north, rather formidable even at that distance. But the submarines are positioned such that they sink two of the cruisers in this force, the Maya and the Otago. They also damage another one, but one of the ships, the Otago, turns out to be Kurita's flagship. So the admiral who is in charge of this fleet is going for a midnight swim as a result. And this is pretty significant. He doesn't die here, he's rescued, but his staff is now picked up by different ships after the catastrophe. His charts and plans and things like that are lost. So now he's continuing the battle with a lesser staff and not the equipment he came with. He moves over to the super battleship Yamato. Why he wasn't on there in the first place, I'm not entirely sure, but that's the one I would have picked. But at any rate, he's now on the Yamato, but he's somewhat hampered in his original contingency. They also managed to damage another cruiser, and two destroyers go escorting them off. So his force has been somewhat diminished, but it still consists of these two super battleships, Yamato and Musashi, and many other cruisers and battleships. So during the daylight, Admiral Kurita is now trying to cross the Sibuyan Sea, and at the same time, the other admirals that are coming up from the south are crossing the Sulu Sea. And Admiral Halsey's reconnaissance aircraft detect them and start bombing them all day. They continuous attacks going on relentlessly all day. Huge number of aircraft attacking these forces. These guys do not have time to eat a meal or do anything. They're just constantly under attack. The Japanese do try one thing with the Musashi and the Yamato. They load in these shells that are full of shrapnel, and the idea, because they don't have any air cover, they're going to fire a barrage of these super 18.1-inch shells to put up a barrage of shrapnel that would hopefully bring down American aircraft. Wasn't very successful, but at least it was an effort on their part. Musashi ultimately succumbs. Many of the pilots concentrate on this huge target being the obvious one, and after many hits and so forth, she finally sinks. This was a ship that was at one time considered unsinkable, but we've heard that term too many times in history. Kurita at this point is, what's the point? He's getting nowhere, he's getting decimated, so he turns around and starts heading back to the west. So that's where we stand at this point. But then we reach the night of 24-25 October. And here, with Kurita, when darkness comes in, he's no longer under attack. He now decides to continue his mission, and he goes back east again towards San Bernardino Strait. Nishimura and Shima are coming up, heading for Surigao Strait. Admiral Kincaid, who's in charge of the forces there of the 7th Fleet at Leyte, makes preparations. Halsey, we'll talk about a little bit later. Kincaid tasks his Admiral Jesse Oldendorf to prepare a welcome to the oncoming Japanese forces. For that, he has PT boats that he stations down at the southern end of Surigao Strait. And they have two tasks. One is to provide early warning to let them know when the Japanese are in fact coming, and the other one is to attack them with torpedo boats. The battleships, he puts it a line way up north, steaming back and forth across Surigao Strait. What's interesting about these battleships is that several of them have been raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor. After the attack at Pearl Harbor, we actually brought a number of these ships back to life. One of the most interesting operations ever is that one of them had turned turtle and was completely upside down, and they put winches on there, and over months slowly winched this ship back upright and then brought it back into service. So you have these battleships up there getting a chance at some revenge for Pearl Harbor. Then the cruisers are a little further south with their shorter range weapons, and they too are steaming back and forth across the strait. And then the destroyers are positioned on both flanks, and their task is to come down along the flanks and to use torpedoes primarily to attack the oncoming Japanese forces. Torpedoes are a very effective weapon against ships for obvious reasons. They hit below the waterline. And the other thing that they're good for is that they do not, guns put off flashes at night, and if you're fighting at night, you don't necessarily want to reveal your position. So torpedoes are a better choice of weapon for that reason. Well, the whole thing plays out as planned. As Nishimura is coming up, Kurita's behind him, by the way, but Nishimura is heading up. And the PT boats, in fact, attack and have very little effect, but they do, in fact, provide the early warning that was needed. And then the battleships and the cruisers open fire, and there's a tremendous barrage of gunfire coming down the Gulf, hitting these ships as they're down the strait as they're coming north. And then the destroyers, in fact, do their attack. The end result is that the Japanese are really hurt. Several things happen. One of the reasons for this is that it was already mentioned, the crossing the T. This is a tactic that's well known in naval circles. Because ships are long and narrow, it's obvious that they have more guns along their sides than they do on the bow or the stern. So if you can get your ship broadside to another ship, you obviously have got a lot more firepower to bring to bear. And what's also important here is that the same thing applies to formations as well as to individual ships. So in fact, the Japanese their T is crossed, suffered great damage as a result. And then the Japanese compounded by their two serious mistakes. The first one is a turn is when all the ships if you have ships in a line and they all turn at the same time, you wind up reversing the column, if you will, in place, so that the lead ship now becomes the last ship. The Korpen is where the ships follow one another. It's kind of like a choo-choo train. If you start turning, when the first ship turns, the second ship follows, and they all go around that way. Well, as it is, Kurita orders what should have ordered a turn to get out from under that fire, but instead ordered a Korpen, which meant that each of his ships took a turn going up under all that hellacious fire. Keep in mind, by the way, that Kurita has gone through a midnight swim. He's been attacked all day the day before. This guy is probably a bit fatigued, if nothing else. So now we talk about Halsey. Halsey's interesting because he was the class in 1904. He earned his wings 30 years later. That's not the way we do it these days. He actually became a pilot that late. Very colorful character. The press loved him. He was very flamboyant, gave a lot of colorful lines to be quoted and so forth. He also was, I say, itching for a fight. And that's kind of a pun in a way because, well, first of all, he wanted to fight desperately. He was a very pugnacious admiral. But as things played out, he missed the Battle of Midway because he had a skin disease that caused tremendous discomfort. He had to be admitted to the hospital. And Spruance wound up taking command of the fleet and became the famous victor at Midway. So Halsey missed that. He was then sent to the South Pacific on Nimitz's orders and did a great job down there, but he was not commanding a fleet per se in those waters. And then as the war progressed, he just always missed the big fights. And when the Battle of the Philippine Sea comes along later, Spruance is in command at that time, and Halsey is, in fact, misses that as well. So he really is desperate to get into a fleet battle. These are Nimitz's instructions to Halsey, telling him to cover and support the forces there in the Southwest Pacific, destroy enemy naval and air forces threatening the Philippine area. I mentioned the Spruance factor in that last slide, and I want to explain that very quickly. At the Battle of Philippine Sea, Spruance was criticized after the battle because even though it was a tremendous American victory, he allowed the Japanese fleet to turn away and to escape, as some people put it. Spruance's explanation, and I agree with him, was that his job was to guard that landing at all costs, not knowing whether other Japanese forces might come from a different direction and so forth. So I think, but he was criticized, should have gone after it, could have ended the Japanese fleet there and then and so forth. So this is also in the back of Halsey's mind. So Halsey saw Kurita turn west in the Sibuyan Sea the day before. His reconnaissance now picks up Ozawa coming down from the north. Ozawa's doing everything he can to be discovered. He's flying what few planes he has down and hoping that Halsey's forces will see him. He even has some of his aircraft lower their tail hooks to make it clear that these are naval aircraft as opposed to land-based. So it's a more tempting target for the Americans. But they do pick up them, and then Halsey decides to go after Ozawa. Absolutely nothing wrong with this decision. I think anybody would say, of course, he would go after enemy forces, carrier forces to the north. Again, keep in mind, he does not know how impotent these carriers are at this point, so he sees them as a genuine threat. The problem with this is that he takes the entire Third Fleet with him when he goes. This is the largest fleet in history, has 4 gigantic task forces, each one with multiple aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers. It's an overwhelming force. Halsey could very well have divided his force, left some behind, and then taken plenty up there to take care of Ozawa. But instead, he took the whole fleet. He does go up to Cape Engano, does attack up there, has a successful campaign against these ships. As I said, they don't have much to fight with. 108 planes against this entire fleet. And conducts airstrikes all day and does a successful operation there. But there's a serious problem going on at this point. And that is because Halsey has taken the force northward, the entire force. And unfortunately, there's been some misunderstandings. Before he left, he had actually proposed, but did not execute, the breaking off of a surface combatant task force to stay behind and guard the landing force. The problem is that Kincaid, remember, these people they're not technically working together, they're not communicating, but Kincaid's been reading Halsey's mail, if you will. He's been hearing these messages, and he makes the assumption that this task force was in fact formed and left behind. Nimitz back in Pearl Harbor also makes the same assumption. As a result, Nimitz gets concerned. There's something going on. He's starting to get some desperate messages, and we'll talk about why in just a minute. But things are not going well off Samar, and he becomes concerned, and he sends a message to Halsey, and he says, "Where is Task Force 34?" And what compounds this thing is the fact that back at this time, to help confuse code breakers and so forth, it was common practice to put padding on each end of a message, nonsense type messages that didn't mean anything, but they would make the message harder to break for the enemy. This one had at the beginning of it, "Turkey trots to water," whatever that means. And unfortunately, the one at the end was picked by somebody picked these out, and I suspect that he was aware of the fact that this was also the anniversary of the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimean War. And at that time, Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote his famous poem, "The Charge of the Light Brigade." And in that poem, the phrase, "the world wonders," appears in that poem. So one can only speculate, but for whatever reason, this phrase is appended there. Means nothing, but Halsey, for some reason, doesn't realize it's padding, and he thinks that Nimitz is prodding him. Nimitz is criticizing him. The world's wondering, where are you? Where the hell is this? That type thing. So Halsey is humiliated and angry, literally throws his cap across the bridge, turns around and heads south to try to get into the battle that's now forming to the south. Unfortunately, it's too late, and the entire Third Fleet now spends the rest of this battle in limbo. Wonderful passage in Herman Wouk's novel, The War and Remembrance. He describes Pug Henry, the major battleship commander there, describing what it was like to be there at this time, and so we're in this moment in history, and being unable to do anything, to be in this state of limbo. At any rate, so what you've got here is you've got the landing forces landed, the 7th Fleet battleships and so forth are there, Halsey's up to the north, Nishimura and Shima have gotten the attention of the 7th Fleet. They're now at Surigao Strait, and Halsey is now lured away by Ozawa, and now you have this landing force with no protection, or very little protection. What is left, and of course Kurita has continued through, and he comes through San Bernardino Strait that morning, starts heading south, and he's now going to become a major threat to the landing force there. The only thing left for this landing force to protect it are 3 task groups with code names Taffy. That doesn't mean anything other than just a code name, but Taffy 1, 2, and 3. These are made up of escort carriers, CVEs. These are very small aircraft carriers, much smaller than the fleet types that are out there launching the major airstrikes and that sort of thing. They primarily provide support, landing support to the troops ashore, and also engage submarines if they happen to show up. They're not equipped for a major fleet battle. In fact, the aircraft there have anti-personnel bombs on them, not anti-ship. And these 3 Taffy groups made up of these aircraft carriers and their escorts, which are destroyers and escorts, are now very vulnerable to this gigantic fleet. So Kurita's coming down from the north. With these 1, 2, and 3 left, the CVEs start, as you can well imagine, heading south very quickly. Their maximum speed, unfortunately, is 18 knots with a good tailwind. Kurita's force is good up 20, 25, 30 knots. So it's going to be a losing race at this point. So Kurita is bearing down on particularly on Taffy 3, the one furthest to the north. Now, this is one of the great moments in naval history that I think we need to pause and think about. These aviators on these carriers do not have proper weapons to fight. They are grossly outnumbered by the number of guns and that sort of thing, and yet they attack. They attack with everything they've got. Some of them are dropping depth charges because that's all they had. They're dropping. Many of them are strafing Kurita's force, which actually has, I think, a significant effect because while he's trying to do his thing, he's constantly having to duck while these aircraft are strafing the bridges and so forth. But they do this at great risk and loss to themselves. And then there's also the destroyers and the destroyer escorts. Now, you can look in American naval history and find other feats that will equal this in terms of courage, but you'll never find anything more courageous, I think, than this. These are tiny ships by comparison to Kurita's force. We're talking battleships and cruisers, and we have destroyers and destroyer escorts. Incredibly outgunned and everything. And yet they charge. And the one that leads the way, incredibly outgunned and everything. And yet they charge. And the one that leads the way is the destroyer USS Johnston. And she's kind of interesting because she's commanded by Commander Ernest E. Evans. He is a Native American graduate of the Naval Academy, class of 1931. At the commissioning of his ship back in Seattle, Washington, he tells the crew that, well, quickly you should know that he was, in the beginning of the war, he was actually at the Battle of Java Sea and wound up, the Americans had to flee that area because there was no way they could stand up to the Japanese. And as he told his crew, I once ran from the Japanese Navy. I promise you I will never do that again. And he He also told them, if any of you do not want to go with me, I intend to go in harm's way, quoting John Paul Jones, and if any of you do not want to go with me, there's the gangway, you can leave now. None of the crew left. As a result of his actions, by the way, he was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. So what we have here, I mentioned the charge of the Light Brigade. There's some comparison here, I think. You have this Corita's battleship and cruiser force bearing down. As they come down, he begins to sink these American ships. You got to understand, these ships are charging at these much more powerful ships, some of them getting in so close that the battleships and cruisers the Japanese cannot depress their guns low enough to shoot at them. They're in that close firing, but they're also eventually grossly outgunned, and they begin to pay the price. The COL and we have several ships are sunk. They eventually even get one of the aircraft carriers, the Gambier Bay, is sunk by gunfire. Then at the critical moment, when all appears to be about as bad as it can be, for some reason, Corita inexplicably breaks off and heads north. You gotta love the American sailor. But it is true that, in fact, Corita did turn away. There's a great deal of speculation about why he did that. If we had time, we could go into a lot of that, but I do think it has a lot to do with several things. One is Corita, of course, as I mentioned, was probably exhausted by this point, maybe not making the best decisions. But also, Corita was not exactly sure what he was encountering. He did not know for sure that there was more out there than just these three small task groups. And particularly the fact, and I think because the Americans attacked so aggressively, despite the odds, I think he probably had a feeling in the back of his mind, like, what do they know that I don't? And I think that had a lot to do with his decision. At any rate, it works out. We have these 4 major engagements. This is actually the end of the Japanese fleet, per se. The Yamato, by the way, does survive, but goes back to Japan, but she gets underway for a suicide mission where she's going down to Okinawa later to actually beach herself and use her big guns to try to help the forces ashore there. And she is also sunk before she gets there. So this is really the end of the Japanese fleet as we know it. However, it's at this same battle that we have the Japanese turning to the divine wind, the kamikaze. And this, of course, becomes the equivalent of what we would call a human-guided missile today. These are literally guided missiles. They're guided by humans instead of electronics that we would do today, but they have the same kind of effect. Very difficult to defend against, and we suffered tremendous casualties at Okinawa and as a result of that. And that, I think, is, no, we don't have any questions. Sorry about that. Finally, and by the way, a good friend of mine told me anytime you're giving a talk, include that word. It gives the audience hope. Finally, I want to just, if you'll bear with me, I want to share something with you. This is the last words of my book on Battle of Leyte Gulf, and I think they say a lot about what we're discussing here. War is probably mankind's greatest folly. It is wasteful, tragic, and frequently unnecessary. But when it does occur, in an ironic twist, it brings out what is in some ways best about mankind. Many brave men, American and Japanese, fought at Leyte Gulf. Too many died there, while others live even today as flesh and blood monuments to those virtues that shine forth from the wreckage and tragedy of war. The causes for which these men fought and sacrificed have faded with time. The machines they used to carry out their deadly business are now rusted relics of another era. The sands have swallowed their footprints, and the waters show no trace of their wakes. But the glory of their deeds will never be tarnished by time.
Thank you, sir. I had the pleasure of having dinner last evening with our Commander Cutler, and I went away that night thinking I wish he had been one of my professors. So thank you, sir. And now I have the privilege of announcing our next speaker, another gentleman that I wish had been one of my professors. Dr. Peter Mansoor is a retired U.S. Army colonel with over 25 years of service. He served as executive officer to General David Petraeus during the Iraq War, and that was a period that included the troop surge of 2007. He is the current chair of military history at Ohio State University, and his work on military history from ancient to modern warfare has earned numerous honors, including the U.S. Army Historical Society and the Society for Military History Distinguished Book Awards. His most recent work focuses on the liberation of the Philippines during World War II, and it will be published this summer.
Well, thank you for having me here today. And being in the home of all things MacArthur, I think I should begin my presentation with a hearty beat Navy. Or maybe beat the Japanese Navy. MacArthur had a desire to return and liberate the Philippines from the moment he left. The entire campaign in New Guinea and in the Southwest Pacific was predicated on getting back there. But that liberation was always going to begin with the island of Mindanao, the southernmost major island in the Philippine archipelago. But that changed in September 1944 when Bull Halsey took his Third Fleet and conducted a series of carrier strikes on the central and southern Philippine islands, the Visayan Islands, or the central Philippines, and then Mindanao, in which he neutralized Japanese air power in the area. One of his pilots was shot down on Leyte. He was saved by the guerrilla movement there and returned to his ship. And he reported that he didn't see any Japanese on Leyte. So Halsey sends a dramatic proposal to his boss, Nimitz, in Hawaii, who forwards it to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that the Allies should bypass Mindanao and start with the invasion of Leyte in the central Philippine Islands. Now, MacArthur was on his way to Morotai, the invasion there, under radio listening silence, and so he didn't receive the message from the Joint Chiefs saying, hey, General MacArthur, what do you think? In fact, that message went to his Chief of Staff, Sutherland, in Hollandia, his forward base on New Guinea. And Sutherland and MacArthur thought as one. It's one of the reasons why MacArthur picked him to be his Chief of Staff, and they were paired at the hip until personal issues separated them near the end of the war. But Sutherland thought he knew, or knew he knew, what MacArthur would reply. So he drafted a reply, and he said, the Cliff Notes version is, we're all in. We agree, we'll go to Leyte first. And he signed the message, not Sutherland, he signed it MacArthur. MacArthur got back from Morotai, was told what had happened, and he goes, yep, good decision, don't ever do that again. Speak in my name. Now that message went to the Joint Chiefs who were not in Washington, D.C. They were in Quebec for one of the many Allied conferences during the war, and they were at a dinner with their British counterparts, and they excused themselves, and in just 90 minutes of discussion, recast the entire strategy for the Pacific War. They decided that indeed MacArthur would invade Leyte on October 20th. They canceled the invasion of Yap, which made 24th Corps available for other duties, and they allocated that formation to MacArthur for the Leyte invasion. So the plan was set. The Japanese were also preparing. They understood that the loss of the Philippines would result in the severing of the empire's logistical lifeline to the resource-rich Dutch East Indies, and with it, Japan's existence as an industrial nation, because Japan received its oil and fuel to fuel its military forces and its industry from the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. According to Vice Admiral Tasuku Nakazawa, the chief of the operations section of the Imperial General Headquarters, after the fall of Saipan, which fell in June and July 1944, the Philippines were the last line of national defense. As soon as the Marianas were lost, Japanese military leaders began to reinforce their forces in the Philippines, shifting air and ground divisions from Manchuria, Formosa, and Southeast Asia to the archipelago. And as Tom noted, the plan for the defense of the Philippines was codenamed Show 1. Halsey followed up his very successful attacks on the Philippines by going north and striking at Japanese airfields on Formosa. And for 3 days, October 12th through the 14th, he pounded the Japanese bases there, destroying hundreds of aircraft. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters made the mistake of taking the air groups that were training on their carriers in the inland sea to repopulate them with naval aircraft after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and putting them into the fight down at Formosa, even though the pilots were not very well trained at that point. And as a result, the Japanese aviators attack with great bravery and die in greater numbers, and they send misleading reports back to base, leading their commanders to conclude that the U.S. Pacific Fleet had suffered severe losses in this battle. Now, damage to the Third Fleet amounted to torpedo hits to two cruisers, the Canberra and the Houston, both of which remained afloat and were towed back to Ulithi Atoll for repair. The Japanese government, though, erroneously claimed and actually believed that its airmen had sunk or heavily damaged 57 warships, including 19 of the Pacific Fleet's carriers, to which Admiral Halsey responded in a wryly humorous message to Nimitz. The Third Fleet's sunken and damaged ships have been salvaged and are retiring at high speed toward the enemy. But the Japanese believed that the Battle off Formosa had evened the odds for the upcoming battle for the Philippines, and this explains a lot in both the air or the naval and the ground side of the equation in the upcoming battle for Leyte Gulf. In the weeks leading up to the American invasion, the Japanese forces underwent a change of command from Lieutenant General Shigenori Kuroda to General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Yamashita was the conqueror of Malaya. He had taken Singapore from the British in the greatest defeat in Commonwealth military history. He was one of the most skilled tacticians in the Japanese army. He possessed a brilliant military mind. And because of all these factors, he was a political danger to Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. And after the fall of Singapore, Yamashita was basically sidelined. He was given a training command up on the border with Russia and Manchuria. And he held that post for more than 2 years while more important actions were being fought elsewhere. But after the loss of the Marianas Islands in the summer of '44, Tojo was ousted from power and Yamashita was resurrected. He took command in the Philippines on October 9th, only 11 days before the American invasion. Of course, he didn't know it was coming. He was plagued by inadequate resources and an inexperienced staff unfamiliar with the Philippines. And this is best exemplified by a remark that was recorded by the official U.S. Army historian, that the state of affairs was well exemplified by the remark of Yamashita's new chief of staff, Lieutenant General Akira Muto, who arrived in the Philippines on the day of the invasion of Leyte, October 20th, from Sumatra, where he had been in command of the 2nd Imperial Guards Division. Told of the landings on Leyte that morning, Muto is reported to have replied, "Ah, very interesting, but where is Leyte?" Upon assuming command, General Yamashita had issued orders to delay the Americans in the Visayas and Mindanao and to fight the decisive battle with the Americans on Luzon, the largest and most important island in the Philippines. Field Marshal Count Hisaichi Taruchi, commander of the Southern Expeditionary Army Group based in Saigon, but for the moment he's in Manila, believed that if U.S. forces were able to construct air bases on Leyte, the 14th Area Army would not be able to successfully defend Luzon. He also falls for the trap that the Battle of Formosa had evened the odds in the Philippines. And so instead of fighting the decisive battle on Luzon, he orders his forces to fight the decisive battle on Leyte. Lieutenant General Saizi Rusi, the chief of the 2nd Department of the Japanese General Staff, remarked that General Yamashita was a bit skeptical at first, which is more than an understatement. I've seen many primary source documents where Yamashita fights tooth and nail with his boss, trying to get him to agree to fight the decisive battle on Luzon. But in the end, Taruchi holds firm, and Yamashita followed his orders to fight the decisive battle for the Philippines on Leyte, which set up a showdown with the 6th U.S. Army under the command of Major General Walter Kruger on the island. And the Japanese Navy was alerted to sail to the Philippines to fight a decisive battle with the Pacific Fleet, which we've heard about. The Leyte was defended by the 16th Division. This was the same Japanese unit that had conquered Bataan. And there were about 22,000 men on Leyte on October 20th, 22,000 Japanese defenders, which would have been a fairly easy operation for 6th Army had it remained that way. Only a light screen of defenders covered the beaches. By this point in the war, the Japanese realized that American firepower will destroy anything that's guarding the beaches, and so they're planning to defend along 3 lines of fortifications built further inland. A-Day, it's not D-Day in the Pacific. They changed the letters up to not to have it mirror D-Day in Normandy, but A-Day for Leyte dawned. It was one of the nicest days of the year. It was like probably the last nice day of 1944 in Leyte at any rate. It dawned, according to one observer, with that quiet beauty which marks the tropics at their best. The sky was clear and bright, the sea calm and blue. And the sea, according to the soldiers, was almost like glass as they moved in on their landing craft. The typhoon season, however, was bearing down on Leyte, and the weather would soon change. Beginning at 0700 hours, the ships of the 7th Fleet pounded the invasion beaches with neutralization fire, while aircraft from the escort fighters hit targets further inland. Battleships pummeled the shore for 2 hours, followed by 45 minutes of fire from cruisers and then 15 minutes of fire from destroyers. And the final salvos came from rocket and mortar-firing landing craft, which in the words of MacArthur's naval attaché, the U.S. Naval Captain Raymond Tarbuck, senior naval advisor, those landing craft launched thousands of rockets that hit the beach with the rumble of an earthquake. It is impossible to distinguish one explosion from another. It is just a roar. The 4 assault divisions stormed ashore at 1000 hours. The 1st Cavalry Division in the north landed on White Beach, closest to the city of Tacloban, with the 24th Infantry Division landing on Red Beach, the 96th Infantry Division landing on Orange and Blue Beaches, and the 7th Infantry Division landing on Violet and Yellow Beaches to its south. The landings, in most cases, were only lightly contested. The largest impediment was the terrain. There were some impenetrable swamps behind some of these beaches, which enveloped some men in mud up to their armpits. Now, famously, MacArthur went ashore 3 hours later at about 1300. His impromptu waiting ashore with Philippine President Sergio Osmeña and their party was captured in what is now an iconic photo. There's a story behind the photo. I'll give you the short version, but MacArthur actually had nice pressed trousers and was planning to give that speech, I have returned, in a nice uniform. But the beachmaster denied them the opportunity to land on what was the only operational jetty in the area, and there were no landing craft small enough that he could transfer to get him all the way to the beach. And so basically the beachmaster said, let him walk. And his boat grounded on a sandbar offshore, and he had to wade through the surf to get to the shore. Now that look on his face, it's an iconic look. Determination, destiny. It's actually anger. He's pissed off at the beachmaster for making him wade through the shore. But once he sees this photo, he realizes, this is my karma. I mean, this is now who I am. So he embraces it. And very few know the true story. You do now. After an hour of exploring the beach under occasional sniper fire, MacArthur broadcast that speech, which you heard at the introduction. The Japanese Navy sortied from its anchorages in Brunei and the Inland Sea to fight what would become to be called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. MacArthur was aboard the cruiser Nashville. It was his headquarters before his headquarters was established ashore. And the captain's like, sir, I need to take my ship down to Surigao Strait to fight the battle there. I need you to move over to the Wasatch, which was a command ship. And MacArthur's like, no, I'm fine here. When do we start? He wanted to be part of the naval battle. And Kincaid instead ordered the Nashville to remain at anchor in Leyte Gulf, not to endanger MacArthur in a sea battle. The 35th Army, the Japanese 35th Army on Cebu, chose to believe that the full force of the American invasion force had been lost in an unsuccessful attempt to invade Formosa. And what they were seeing now were stragglers from a great tropical storm which were straggling ashore in Leyte Gulf. There had been a tropical storm that had hit the Seventh Fleet as it sailed up towards Leyte Gulf, but it didn't impede its movement. But you have 4 combat divisions coming ashore, and somehow the Japanese think that these are just stragglers. Yamashita followed his orders and heavily reinforced his forces on Leyte. Over the next several weeks, the crack 1st Division, probably the best division in the Japanese Army, moved from Manchuria. 2 regiments of the 26th Division, the 68th Independent Mixed Brigade, and elements of the 30th and the 102nd Divisions, which were down on Mindanao, for a total of 38,000 reinforcing troops, all made their way to Leyte. So instead of meeting 22,000 Japanese, 6th Army meets 60,000 Japanese. And Japanese commanders were confident of their chances. On November 2nd, the headquarters of the 35th Army deployed from C2 to Leyte to assume direct control of the battle. After receiving reinforcements along with orders to fight the decisive battle on Leyte, Major General Yoshiharu Tomochika, the Chief of Staff of the 35th Army, recalled, "We had hopeful discussions of entering Tacloban by the 16th of November. We were determined to take offensive after offensive and clean up the American forces on Leyte Island according to original plans. We seriously discussed demanding the surrender of the entire American Army after seizing General MacArthur." The 1st Cavalry Division in the northern portion of the beachhead was a regular Army unit that had been dehorsed. Of course, it didn't bring its horses to the Pacific. and it converted to an infantry division, albeit one with its original cavalry division. On the afternoon of October 21st, the 7th Cavalry Regiment liberated Tacloban, the provincial capital of Leyte, to the delight of its citizens who lined the streets and waved American flags as they welcomed their liberators. And this is something I found throughout my research. The Filipinos were genuinely happy to see the Americans return after 3 years of really horrendous Japanese occupation, which killed thousands of Filipinos. Radio reporter William Dunn followed MacArthur for most of his time in the Philippines, and he recalled, "I expected a welcome from the Filipino people, but never in my wildest dreams did I expect to witness scenes such as those that greeted the returning Americans. The first American troops to enter the city were greeted with mingled tears and laughter, and with cheers that were almost inarticulate because of the emotion behind them." Of perhaps greater import to the cavalrymen was the seizure of an enormous cache of San Miguel beer, which the division commander, Major General Vernon Mudge, immediately ordered issued to the frontline troops. According to the 1st Cavalry Brigade Commander, Brigadier General William C. Chase, "It was warm, but its tactical effect was truly miraculous." MacArthur arrived on the afternoon of October 23rd to restore the Philippine civil government under President Osmeña in a ceremony in front of the provincial capitol building. To the south of the 1st Cavalry Division, the 24th Infantry Division attacked through the high ground to the northern end of Leyte Valley and then towards Carigara Bay on Leyte's northern coast. After overcoming stiff opposition, the 19th Infantry reached the town of Palau late on October 21st and was met by a scene of jubilation. According to the GIs, as the troops entered the town, the Filipinos poured out in a great welcoming crowd. The church bell rang and the people brought gifts of food and a type of Japanese soft drink, which they proffered to their liberators. Ragged and dirty as they were, many only recently bereaved through deaths of family members killed during one phase or another of the fighting, the Filipinos were nevertheless almost beside themselves with joy at the return of the Americans. Even the smallest children held up their fingers in the V for victory sign. The 96th Division, nicknamed the Deadeyes, was new to combat. Leyte was actually its first test. The 1,400-foot-high Katmon Hill dominated its beachhead area. On A+1, the 1st Battalion, 383rd Infantry moved towards the southern side of the hill, while the other 2 battalions of the regiment attempted to envelop it. The flanking maneuver was easier said than done, again because of the terrain. There were no roads in the division zone, and vehicles could not traverse the swampy ground behind the beach, so there was very little tank support. It was a hard job for a man to get through with just a rifle. It was a prodigious one for him to carry a machine gun or a mortar on his back, records the division history. At times, the men had to crawl on hands and knees to keep from sinking into the grasping muck. Nevertheless, after 3 days of slogging through swamps and fighting the Japanese, by October 29th, the entire Katmon Hill area was in American hands. The Deadeyes then advanced to the foothills of the mountain range that separates Leyte on its north-south axis, where it hit a Japanese defensive line manned by the remnants of the 16th Division. In the southern portion of the American beachhead, the 7th Infantry Division seized Dulag Airfield on A+1. The Hourglass, because of the shape of its patch, its combat patch, was a veteran division, having fought to liberate Attu in the Aleutian Islands in May 1943 and seized Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands in a very successful operation in February 1944. Many of the soldiers were veterans of these campaigns, with the attendant battle scars to prove it. One of the fighting men in these early battles was Private John Schult of Toledo, Ohio, who stated, "We learned the hard way, but it was the quick way, the one lesson way." Now on Leyte, the soldiers were again ready to put their experience to the test. The division advanced to liberate the town of Burawan on October 24th and the 3 airstrips nearby, without which Kenny, Lieutenant General George Kenny, the commander of the 5th Air Force, assumed that his aircraft would be left stranded back in New Guinea unless they got these airfields. He was wrong, because torrential rains would soon render the airfields inoperable, and his aircraft ended up operating out of Tacloban and Dulag instead. And finally, that wonderful word, right? Last slide. By the end of the Battle of Leyte Gulf on October 26th, the beachhead was secure and 6th Army was advancing toward the mountains that separated the Leyte and Ormoc valleys. The 38,000 Japanese reinforcements brought in by 9 convoys from late October to early December stymied 6th Army's advance in a bid to fight that decisive battle on Leyte. Weather was a crucial factor. Several typhoons hit the island, along with constant rain, and it turned the few poor roads into seas of mud. In some cases, Kruger's troops had to use landing craft to cart supplies over the water to bypass portions of the road on the north coast that had turned into impassable swamps. For 6 weeks, the fighting was a slow, grinding stalemate. But the turning point came on December 7th, yes, the 3rd anniversary after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when the 77th Infantry Division conducted an amphibious turning movement on the west coast of Leyte and then attacked north to seize the port city of Ormoc, thereby stranding the Japanese forces and severing them from their only supply base on the island. MacArthur, in MacArthur style, declared the campaign over on December 26, despite the fact that the 8th Army would spend the next several months killing more than 27,000 Japanese soldiers who remained on the island. Lieutenant General Robert Eckelberger, commander of 8th Army, decries in his memoir that MacArthur would end campaigns to get the PR value out of it, and then the soldiers would be assigned to what he termed mopping up duty. Well, no one wants to die in mopping up duty, and but that's what it was termed. And Eckelberger fights the rest of the Japanese army on Leyte and destroys them. In MacArthur's defense, all the major cities had been taken, all the airfields had been taken, and the Japanese were pretty much stranded in the mountains with nothing to eat. The battle for Leyte was indeed decisive, but in favor of the Americans. The rest of the Japanese were killed fighting for their emperor, or they died of starvation in the remote areas once 6th Army had seized all the ports on the island. For MacArthur and his forces, it was the first objective on his way back to Luzon and the Philippine capital city of Manila. These I took on a tour that I went to the Philippines with the Marine War College, and they went to Bataan and Corregidor, and Gordon Rudd and I went down to Leyte and got to explore around down there. There is actually a MacArthur Wading Ashore Memorial on Leyte, and there is a holiday in Leyte, MacArthur Day, on October 20th. They celebrate it every year. Kids get off school. It's a big deal. So anyway, I am sorry that I'm going to have to leave right away, so I'm not going to be able to see you afterwards, but I have a plane to catch at 1 o'clock. And anyway, thank you all for your attention and for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you, sir. That was wonderful. Thank you again to Commander Cutler. And thank you, of course, to Dr. Romulo of our board for being here with us this morning. Thank you to the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation and to the Navy League of Hampton Roads for sponsoring this event today. And of course, thank you all for being here as well and being a part of this commemorative event. So this concludes our program today, but we hope that we will see you again at future events, both here and at the Hampton Roads Naval Museum. Thank you.